Most people imagine Israelite worship as pure devotion to one God, occasionally interrupted by isolated moments of idolatry. The truth is different. What actually happened demanded centuries of secret shrines, wooden poles planted beside Yahweh's altar, and queens who ruled the kingdom with the name of Asherah on their lips. This is the story of the goddess Israel worshipped in secret. Picture the scene. Inside the Temple of Jerusalem, the building Solomon raised with cedar from Lebanon and gold from Ophir, there stood something the priests could not remove, a carved pole, tall, dark, silent. It remained there for decades under the reigns of successive kings, and no one, no prophet, no reformer, no high priest dared to touch it until a boy named Josiah discovered the scroll of the law hidden in the walls of the sanctuary during a routine restoration. Consider the paradox. Israel, the people chosen to worship one invisible God, kept a wooden goddess inside the very house dedicated to him. Not for a year, not for a decade. For most of the monarchic period, from Solomon to the fall of Jerusalem, Asherah stood there, sometimes cut down, always replanted. This is who she was, and this is why Israel again and again returned to her. Set aside for a moment everything you learned about Canaanite religion in Sunday school. The Asherah of the Bible is not a marginal figure invented by rebellious kings. She was one of the most ancient and powerful deities of the entire Near East, worshipped for at least 3,000 years before Christ across regions stretching from the coast of modern Lebanon down through Palestine and into the Sinai. Her name appears in tablets discovered at Ugarit on the northern Syrian coast, written in cuneiform script dating back to the 14th century before Christ. In those texts, uncovered by French archaeologists starting in 1928, Asherah is called Athirat, the wife of El, the supreme father god of the Canaanite pantheon. She is described as the mother of 70 divine sons. She is titled Lady of the Sea, progenitress of the gods, the one who walks by the shore. 70 sons, not a metaphor, a specific number, mentioned 3 separate times in the Baal cycle, one of the most complete religious epics of the ancient world. Now dimension the challenge Israel faced. The Hebrews entered Canaan around the 13th century before Christ, according to conventional archaeological chronology. They did not arrive in an empty land. They arrived in a region saturated with temples, altars, and sacred groves dedicated to Asherah, Baal, El, Anat, Astarte, Mot, and dozens of minor deities. Every hill of any significance had a shrine. Every ancient tree of unusual size had ribbons, poured oil, small offerings tied to its lower branches. Every fertile field had a small clay figure of the goddess buried at its edge. Archaeologists have already recovered over 3,000 female figurines of the so-called pillar type in excavations across Israel and Judah, dating from the 10th to the 6th century before Christ. 3,000, just from the sites already excavated. Most were found inside residential homes, not in public temples, inside the private houses of common Israelite families. The pillar type is unmistakable. A slender clay body, prominent breasts held by the goddess's own hands, a molded or painted head. No feet. She stands like a fixed pole, planted in the ground of the home. She is Asherah in miniature, the household version of the same goddess who received the great wooden poles in the mountain sanctuaries. Silence. That is what the biblical text falls into whenever it describes the daily reality of the average Israelite. The Bible narrates the great confrontations, the reforms, the destruction of the high places. It rarely describes what happened between one reform and another, and what happened, according to archaeology, was continuity, persistent worship, domestic, silent, transmitted from mother to daughter across generations that no royal decree could touch. Observe now the physical form the goddess took in Israelite territory. Unlike Baal, who received bronze statues, and unlike El, represented as a seated, bearded figure, Asherah was manifested through a wooden pole, sometimes a living tree planted at the sanctuary, sometimes a carved trunk stripped of its branches and set upright, sometimes a stylized figure sculpted at the top of the pole, with hints of face and breasts. The Hebrew word is Asherah, in lowercase plural Asherim. In the Old Testament, the term appears about 40 times, and translators have long debated its precise meaning. Sometimes the word refers to the goddess herself, sometimes to the wooden object that represents her. In practical terms, for the ancient worshipper, there was no difference. The pole was the goddess. Approaching the pole was approaching her presence. Consider the practical logic of that. A stone statue takes months to carve and requires quarry rock, specialized tools, and metallurgical knowledge worth the wages of an entire village for half a year. A wooden pole can be made in a single day by any farmer with a bronze axe. If a king tears down the pole, the local community erects another one the following week. Portability was Asherah's greatest tactical advantage against every attempt at reform. The book of Deuteronomy addresses this in chapter 16, verse 21. Do not plant any tree as an Asherah beside the altar of the Lord your God. The commandment is direct, specific, non-negotiable, and it is precisely the commandment most repeatedly violated throughout the 400 years of the monarchy. Presents the scene of a Canaanite high place before the reforms. You are climbing a hill in the region of Samaria in the 9th century before Christ. At the top, there is a leveled circular platform, roughly 12 meters in diameter, about the size of the center circle of a modern basketball court. In the middle, a raised stone altar, blackened by centuries of burnt offerings. Behind the altar, standing stones, called massebot in Hebrew. And beside the standing stones, always beside them, the sacred pole, tall 3 to 4 meters, cedar or oak, sometimes covered with fabrics dyed purple. Around the platform, containers of poured oil, remains of grain offerings, small clay figures deposited by women who had come up asking for children. The archaeological complex of Tel Dan in northern Israel preserves the physical structure of one of these high places with remarkable precision. The stone platform is still there. Excavated between 1966 and 1999 by Avraham Biran, the site revealed exactly the arrangement described in the biblical texts, down to the ceremonial staircase and the horned altar. Now examine how the mixture began at the highest political level. Solomon, the son of David, ascended the throne around 970 before Christ. He inherited a small kingdom, still fragile, and transformed it into a regional power through diplomatic marriages. According to the account in 1 Kings chapter 11, he took 700 wives from princely families and 300 concubines, 1,000 women in total, each one arriving with her retinue, her priests, her domestic gods. The biblical text is explicit in verse 5. Solomon followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. In verse 7, he built high places for Chemosh of Moab and for Molech of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. It is the passage in which the wisest king in Israel's history opens the door of official syncretism. Dimension the political cost. Every foreign wife brought a treaty of alliance. Every treaty preserved the fragile peace of the kingdom. Rejecting the gods of the wives meant rejecting the diplomatic covenants and risking economic collapse. Solomon chose the peace of the kingdom over the purity of worship, and the price of that choice would be paid generation after generation for nearly 4 centuries. The high places east of Jerusalem, on the Mount of Olives, and on the ridge, later called the Mount of Corruption, would remain active from the 10th century until the reign of Josiah in the late 7th. 300 years of continuous worship in plain sight of the temple. Kings raised, kings tore down, kings raised again. The cycle became structural. Then came the division. After the death of Solomon in 931 before Christ, the kingdom split into two. Judah in the south, with Jerusalem as its capital, Israel in the north, with Samaria as its center of power. And in the north, syncretism ceased to be tolerated. It became official policy. Jeroboam, the first king of the north, installed two golden calves as objects of worship, one in Bethel and one in Dan. He established a parallel priesthood, appointed a rival religious calendar, and consolidated a kingdom that from birth walked outside the covenant. But the greatest expansion of Asherah's cult would come a few decades later with a single strategic marriage. Ahab, the seventh king of Israel, ascended to the throne around 874 before Christ and married Jezebel, princess of Sidon, daughter of Ethbaal, priest-king of the coastal Phoenician city. Not one wife among many. The queen, the dominant political voice, and she brought with her something no previous queen had brought openly. An official cult, financed by the royal palace, of 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, 400 prophets of Asherah, eating at the royal table. That specific figure appears in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 19. Not a symbolic number, an operational structure, 400 functionaries dedicated exclusively to the worship of the goddess, sustained by the treasury of the palace of Samaria. Calculate the magnitude of that transformation. If a village had 30 homes, and each home followed the guidance of a prophet or prophetess of Asherah, 400 professional religious figures could serve directly a population equivalent to 12,000 families. Almost the entire adult population of the Northern Kingdom in that period had regular ritual contact with the goddess. This was not an underground movement. It was the state religion, printed on the doorposts of the palace. Elijah's confrontation on Mount Carmel, in the same chapter 18, focused on the prophets of Baal. The prophets of Asherah are mentioned as invited, but do not participate in the ordeal of fire. Some scholars suggest that Jezebel deliberately held them back, protecting them from the confrontation. Others argue they were on Mount Carmel, but the biblical narrative concentrates dramatically on Baal, the more visible antagonist. In either case, the 400 prophets of Asherah survived that day. And after the death of Ahab, and after the death of Jezebel thrown from a window by servants of Jehu in a bloody royal purge, Asherah's cult continued. The great cleansing of Jehu, described in 2 Kings chapter 10, focused on Baal. Verse 28 is precise. Jehu destroyed Baal from Israel. Verse 29 adds the crucial detail. The golden calves of Bethel and Dan remained, and Asherah, according to the text of 2 Kings chapter 13, verse 6, also remained. Even the sacred pole she stood in Samaria. The reforms were always partial. The most visible layer of syncretism was cut. The deeper layer, closer to daily life, persisted. Now walk with the narrative to the southern kingdom. Judah preserved the Davidic line and the Jerusalem temple, but it did not preserve pure worship. Kings alternated between reformers and syncretists in an exhausting cycle. Asa tore down the poles. His grandson Uzziah tolerated them. Ahaz sacrificed his own son in the fire, following Canaanite ritual practice described in 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 3. And then arose the king who took syncretism to its structural apex. Manasseh, son of the reformer Hezekiah, took the throne around 697 before Christ at the age of 12. He would reign for 55 years. The longest reign in the history of Judah and the most religiously destructive. 2 Kings chapter 21 describes Manasseh's actions in a sequence that reads like a systematic checklist of every prohibition of the covenant. He rebuilt the high places his father had destroyed. He raised altars for Baal. He made an Asherah. As had done Ahab, king of Israel, he worshipped the whole host of heaven and served it. He built altars in the house of the Lord. He sacrificed his own son in the fire. He practiced divination and consulted mediums. And here the first loop planted at the beginning of this narrative closes. Verse 7 of the same chapter states the fact with brutal clarity. Manasseh took the carved image of Asherah he had made and put it in the temple, inside the sanctuary, inside the house dedicated exclusively to Yahweh. The wooden goddess of the Canaanites was raised in the place where God himself had said he would put his name forever. Silence. That is what the biblical text describes about the reactions of the priests of the temple. No account of resistance, no public confrontation. The prophet Isaiah, according to Jewish tradition preserved in the Ascension of Isaiah, was sawed in half during Manasseh's reign. Whether historical or legendary, the tradition points to a solid historical fact. There was silencing, there was persecution. The Reform Party was crushed for 2 generations. Consider the human cost of that period. Manasseh, according to 2 Kings chapter 21, verse 16, shed innocent blood in such quantity that he filled Jerusalem from end to end. Modern archaeologists estimate the population of Jerusalem at that time between 25,000 and 40,000 inhabitants. Filling the city with innocent blood, even accounting for hyperbole in the biblical language, suggests hundreds, perhaps thousands, of executed dissidents, a silent civil war waged block by block that erased the religious opposition and normalized Asherah in the daily life of the capital. Meanwhile, in the surrounding countryside, the everyday practice continued as it always had. Excavations at rural sites such as Beersheba, Arad, and Tel Rehov revealed household altars, ceramic incense burners, and pillar-type female figurines in dozens of average residences. In Arad specifically, in the excavations conducted by Yohanan Aharoni between 1962 and 1967, a small temple was uncovered with an altar and 2 standing stones, one taller than the other. The most solid archaeological interpretation is that the taller stone represented Yahweh and the smaller one represented Asherah, understood in that region as his divine consort. That interpretation gained explosive force with 2 epigraphic discoveries. In 1975, a team led by Ziv Meshel excavated the site of Kuntilet Ajrud in the northern Sinai desert. On the plaster of walls and on fragments of storage jars, they found inscriptions in ancient Hebrew that made scholars around the world reread the biblical text. One of the inscriptions reads, "I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria and by his Asherah, Yahweh and his Asherah, as husband and wife, as deity and consort," written on the wall of a stopping point on the caravan route by average travelers in 8th century Hebrew before Christ. Not the writing of dissident priests, common Israelites recording with domestic naturalness what they truly believed. The second inscription came from the tomb of Khirbet el-Kom in the Judean hills, discovered in 1967 and correctly deciphered later. The text reads, "Blessed is Uriah by Yahweh, for from his enemies by his Asherah he saved him." Again the pairing. Again the domestic assumption that the 2 divinities acted together. No epigrapher disputes the readings. The academic debate revolves around whether the term Asherah in the inscriptions refers to the goddess herself or to a sacred object associated with her. In practical terms, for popular religion, the distinction is irrelevant. The average Israelite of the 8th century before Christ prayed to Yahweh and to Asherah together, without perceiving contradiction. The Reform Party did not die. It went underground. It preserved manuscripts, priestly traditions, and prophetic memory in enclaves scattered across the countryside and among more conservative Levite priests. And in 640 before Christ, with the assassination of Amon, son of Manasseh, an 8-year-old boy took the throne. His name was Josiah. Presence, the moment. Josiah reigns for 18 years under the influence of a divided court, with reformist priests slowly regaining political space. In the 18th year of his reign, around 622 before Christ, during renovation works on the temple, the high priest Hilkiah finds a scroll hidden in the walls. Most scholars identify this scroll with an early version of Deuteronomy. Josiah reads the scroll. He tears his royal robes, and he begins the most radical religious reform in the history of Judah. 2 Kings chapter 23 describes each step of the reform in specific detail. He removed from the temple all the objects made for Baal, for Asherah, and for the host of heaven. He burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of the Kidron Valley. He crushed the ashes and threw them on public graves. He tore down the ritual chambers of the cult prostitutes that were in the house of the Lord, in the very place where women wove garments for Asherah. That detail is crucial. Chambers inside the temple dedicated to women who wove ritual garments for Asherah. Not one occasional room. An operational structure active for decades, integrated into the physical architecture of the temple. That is the specific loop that opened at the beginning of this narrative. The dark pole that stood inside the sanctuary. Josiah found it. Josiah cut it down. Josiah burned it. He went further. He desecrated the high places from Geba to Beersheba, marking the northern and southern borders of the kingdom, a distance of roughly 120 kilometers, equivalent to the journey from Boston to Providence, covered on foot altar by altar. He tore down the altars of Bethel in the northern kingdom already fallen to Assyria. He exhumed the bones of the pagan priests buried near the altars and burned them over the same altars. Verse 25 of chapter 23 offers the maximum evaluation. Never before Josiah was there a king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart, with all his soul, and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses. But the reform came late. Verse 26 of the same chapter warns, "Yet the Lord did not turn from the fierceness of his great anger, with which his anger was kindled against Judah, because of all the provocations that Manasseh had provoked him with." The verdict had already been pronounced. Josiah cleaned the surface. The underground layer of syncretism, cultivated for 400 years, remained. Josiah died on the plain of Megiddo in 609 before Christ, hit by Egyptian arrows in a battle against Pharaoh Necho. He was 39 years old. His son Jehoahaz reigned for 3 months before being deposed. His son Jehoiakim reversed the reforms. His grandson Jehoiakim surrendered to the Babylonians in 597. His son Zedekiah led the final rebellion and saw his sons murdered before his own eyes were gouged out by Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers in 586 before Christ. Jerusalem burned. The temple, with its walls of stone and its cedar beams, was demolished. The remaining sacred vessels were taken to Babylon. The upper class was deported in 3 waves between 597 and 582 before Christ. The people who remained on the land, poor and rural, continued for decades to worship in the ruins of the high places, according to the prophet Jeremiah in chapter 44. And precisely in Jeremiah 44, a text often overlooked, the reader finds one of the most surprising accounts of the entire Bible. Jewish refugees who fled to Egypt after the fall of Jerusalem told the prophet with unshakable conviction that the destruction of the kingdom had happened exactly because they had stopped burning incense to the Queen of Heaven. The Queen of Heaven. Almost all scholars identify this figure with Asherah or with a syncretic form of Asherah and Astarte. Read the exact words of the passage in verses 17 and 18. "We will certainly do everything we have said. We will burn incense to the Queen of Heaven and pour out drink offerings to her. as we and our fathers, our kings and our officials did in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. Then we had plenty of food, we prospered, and we saw no evil. But since we stopped burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, we have lacked everything and have been consumed by the sword and by famine. The theological inversion is total. In the interpretation of those refugees, the fall of Jerusalem was not divine punishment for idolatry. It was divine punishment for the abandonment of Asherah. That is how deeply worship of the goddess had rooted itself in the popular religious imagination of Judah, and that is why exile, not reform, was the only instrument capable of cutting her out at the root. Consider the human cost across those 4 centuries. Children burned in the ritual fires of the Ben Hinnom Valley in numbers that Jeremiah calls too many to count. Wives who wove garments for Asherah while their sons died on the walls of besieged cities. Levite priests exiled from their functions when they refused to serve at the high places. Reformist prophets sawn in half, buried in unmarked graves, thrown into cisterns to die of hunger and thirst, as Jeremiah nearly did. Every reform brought its dead. Every relapse into syncretism produced others, and the price, added generation by generation, ended in the smoke rising over the ruins of the temple in 586 before Christ. The rebuilding of the temple under Zerubbabel in 516 before Christ marked the effective end of Asherah's cult in official Jewish worship. The Babylonian exile purged, painfully and definitively, the goddess from the community that returned to reorganize itself around the Torah. The pole was never raised again. The chambers of the weavers were never rebuilt. The pillar-type figurines gradually disappeared from the archaeological record. But the goddess did not disappear from the surrounding cultures. She survived under other names, in other traditions, absorbed by Astarte in Phoenician territory, by Aphrodite in the Greek Mediterranean, by Isis in Egypt. The archetype of the mother goddess, associated with fertility, love, sacred trees, and domestic protection, would continue for centuries wherever the biblical reform had not fully arrived. The lesson embedded in the 400 years of Asherah's coexistence within Israel is uncomfortable and universal. Compromised worship rarely dies in public confrontation. It survives in secondary chambers, in transmitted domestic habits, in comfortable spiritual adjustments that no one wants to confront. The prophets thundered against the visible poles. The women wove garments in the invisible chambers. And it was in the invisible chambers that the goddess most resisted. Every reform of Israel touched what was visible and hesitated before what was intimate. Every subsequent generation had to decide again what to keep and what to cut. The pole outside the sanctuary was the easy fight. The pole inside the sanctuary was the fight that took Josiah 18 years of maturation to face. That is the true story of Asherah. Not the account of an exotic pagan goddess. The account of how what is secretly cherished endures longer than what is officially prohibited. And when history closes over the walls of Jerusalem in flames, it is not just the temple that falls. It is the illusion that syncretism can be sustained indefinitely without cost.